So welcome to the afternoon session. And is this mic working? Okay. We'll pretty much follow the same format as the earlier session. We will start with the panelists making a short 10-minute presentation, and Catherine is going to wave her arms. Maybe you should, do you indicate when they have finished 5 minutes and then sort of also give a 10-minute alarm? Okay, super. So we have a very diverse panel this afternoon with academic researchers, with people from local governments, and someone from community organization all presenting. So should make for a very interesting session. And the session is entitled The Context for Resilience. So we'll talk, we already talked about the context for resilience in the first panel, but I think here we'll get down to more specifics on how the context and the place matters for resilience. So I'll follow Millie's example and just introduce each panelist as they come to the stage rather than introduce all of them at once, all at once. We have our first presenter, James R. Elliott, who is professor of sociology at Rice University. And he's going to talk about Beyond Disaster, taking a broader look at natural hazards and social vulnerability through nationally representative sampling. So I presume he's going to touch upon some of the issues that David talked about earlier. Here's some background information on James. James Elliott received his PhD in sociology with a minor in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1997, after which he worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before coming to Rice, he received tenure at the University of Oregon and Tulane University, where he earned university-wide teaching awards for undergraduate, graduate, and service learning education. His early research focused primarily on urban development and social inequality with emphasis on racial, ethnic, and gender stratification. It examined how internal migration shapes and reshapes the urban system, how globalization contributes to structural underemployment, how neighborhood segregation shapes job networks and opportunities, and how ethnic divisions of labor form and persist over time. More recent research incorporates growing emphasis on urban environmental change in three related areas. One focuses on social inequalities revealed and exacerbated by natural hazards and local recoveries. Another focuses on the historical accumulation and systematic spread of hazardous waste in urban areas. And the third focuses on links between urbanization and carbon emissions at and from the local level. These lines of research conceptualize urbanization as an ongoing interaction of social and environmental processes that feed back over time and space to shape the prospects of a sustainable future. Professor Elliott has received funding from multiple federal agencies, served as an advisor to the National Science Foundation's program in sociology, and currently co-edits the journal Sociological Perspectives. James?
Okay. Nobody look. It's not open yet. Okay. Thanks, Anil. I want to join my colleagues in thanking those who organized this panel. This has been a wonderful learning opportunity for me. What I want to do is use the most of my time. So I'm just going to hop into it here and see if I can extend a theme that David, it's moving on its own, that David began, which is this problem of disaster exceptionalism. So what I want to do is be a bit of a contrarian and talk to a conference full of attendees expecting to think about disaster. And I want to think about what we can do to think beyond disaster and take a broader look at social vulnerability and possibly resilience. So just to give you a little background, I'm not against studying disasters. I think they're important. My foray into this field actually started when I was a professor at Tulane. I was in New Orleans when Katrina hit, volunteering at a hospital that my wife worked at. And so after that event, got involved in studying some of the recovery processes there and continue to be very interested in what's happening in New Orleans and elsewhere after extreme events. But after moving to Houston recently, and as most of you also know, anywhere you are in the US, there are actually many chronic hazards. There are hazards going on all the time. So one of the things that I wanted to begin to think about is how we integrate that conversation into that of resilience and vulnerability. So this is the sort of this oversimplified model of disasters, whereby we usually conceptualize disasters an interaction of some natural hazard event. I'm going to focus just on natural hazards for today, times the social vulnerabilities, and then you have your disaster. But the reality is that natural hazards are actually going on all the time. I'll show you some maps here to make that point. But if you look at any given year, the average county in the United States experiences 5 registered natural hazards that created at least some property damage and or some injury or fatality. And we also know that social vulnerabilities with respect to inequality and poverty are also chronic. So we have 2 things that are actually going on all the time. So what I want to think about is how they intersect over time by taking a slightly different approach. Thinking about the successive or cumulative interactions of hazardous events in a local area as they interface with social vulnerabilities. Rather than going to the event, go to the people. So one way we can look at that is to take a look at California, just as an example. So if we look at the data from last year, 2015, there was only one federally declared disaster in California, and it was the Valley Fire that happened in the late summer, early fall, and it damaged about 1,300 residents. And the direct property damage was about $10 million. But if you go to the database and look at all natural hazards that were registered in California during the same year, 2015, there were actually 374 county events, whether it be mudslides, fires, whatnot. And the direct property damage from all of those events was about 110 million. So you actually have about 90% of what's going on with respect to natural hazard damages unaccounted for when we focus just on extreme events. So how will we begin to look at this methodologically? So again, one of the common ways to do that is to take this event-centered approach. Go to a major disaster. I'm from the Gulf, so we think in terms of hurricanes, so that's the hurricane symbol. And you see, who's there and what happens to them. I'm interested oftentimes in what happens to people spatially. So do people get displaced? What happens to their housing? But another way to think about it is in terms of a population-centered analysis, where we don't go to an event and see what happens to the people there, but we start with a person and we follow them through time as the hazards begin to accumulate in the places that they live. This has a timer of its own, apparently. So what I want to do is basically use that model. Start with the individuals and have them go through time and experiences rather than with the event and follow the people. And see what that can teach us about some of these interactions. So the data sets, you probably are not particularly interested in this point, but what we're doing is we're bringing secondary data sets to bear on this. So one of the main ones where we're going to get our hazard data is from the Sheldis database, which collates a number of federal databases into one county level across the U.S. database that gives us information on the amount of property damage from various natural hazards. We're going to link that to a longitudinal study called the Panel Study for Income Dynamics, which is a representative sample of people in the U.S. And we're going to start and just focus from the late 90s forward. And then we're going to also add some census data. So the main dependent variable that we're interested in is housing instability. That is the extent to which people move from one place to another, or one residence to another. And I can go into a little bit more about why we selected that, but it's important both for research on social inequality as well as disaster research. The major independent variable that we want to see what the relationship with this is the natural hazard damage to the county over time as it builds over time. So not from one event, it can be one event, or it can be several events over time as it adds up over this 1999 to 2011 framework. So what we're going to do is think about vulnerability in terms of a number of different indicators. At the individual level, we're going to think about people's race and ethnicity, their immigrant status or foreign-born, education, et cetera, age. We also have information on their family and household characteristics, and we have the restricted data on the neighborhood characteristics of where they live. So we have all these variables measured every 2 years. We're going to follow people through time. We're going to see how the damage from natural hazards where they live affects their residential instability, net of these factors and in conjunction with these factors. So again, the unit of analysis is the individual. We're going to stratify by gender, look at men and women differently or separately. And we're going to run some of these negative binomial regressions. Basically what we're doing is we're trying to predict the number of times that people move over this time period. So again, if we look at the natural hazard damage, we find that all those shaded areas are areas where we've had natural hazard damage. There are only 5 counties in the U.S. over the span that had no major damage. And that's not because natural hazards didn't occur. It's because they didn't affect the property that's there. So the point is, natural hazards are ubiquitous. They're ongoing. They're pervasive. They're everywhere. We tend to think of unique disasters, but this is actually an ongoing process. So, results. This is just an illustration from the female-only models. The x-axis is the amount of damage from property, or from natural hazards to property, and it's an upward slope. We can then control for various background factors, income, education, household status, and we still see an upward slope. So there is an effect of damage on residential instability over time. Then what we do is we use some longitudinal modeling, and we set in motion. Every 2 years, we'll add some more damage. If you were in a county that experienced $20 million in damage in that 2-year frame, you will then experience $20 million in this equation. We'll go forward. This just shows you that over time, almost all the counties are experiencing some damage, but there's variation. But over time, almost everybody is being subjected to this. So we get to the aggregate, and what we find, again, with the male population is we can look at certain populations. Those who do not own their own property tend to have an increased residential instability. So this is over and above the control variables. So multiplicatively, renters are experiencing greater instability the more an area experiences damage, whether it's a big disaster or smaller events that accumulate over time. Same with, we can look, you can't read that very well, but that's education levels. So those males with lower education, the more you experience natural hazard damage over time, the more your residential instability goes up. That is, the more you're having to move around. With women, same. The lower your education, the more you're going to have to move around as natural hazards damage your county. We can begin to look at this as well. You can't read this very well, but this is white single women, black single women, Hispanic single women versus the average married at the bottom here. So that's average married. What we find in particular here is that single women of color, black and Latina women, are the ones who experience the most damage. And again, this is not controlling for, and because they have less education or less income, it's multiplicatively above that, even more than what we'd expect given those lower forms and stocks of social and human capital. So the big picture here is that over time, you do not need big disasters. You can have smaller disasters accumulating gradually over time to increase the residential instability of socially vulnerable groups. So in looking beyond disasters to think about this, what we can see is that these things accumulate over time. So actually, there are communities throughout the United States that are continually going through the process of having lower income sectors and segments of their housing market affected by residential instability tied to natural hazard damage. This is especially true or multiplicatively true among socially vulnerable groups, especially women of color. And so if we're going to think about resilience, what we need to think about, we would argue, is that you need to move, or we need to move, beyond just responding to disasters, but thinking about ongoing interactions between natural hazard damage and vulnerability on an everyday basis. Thank you.
Thank you, James. The next panelist is Faith Kearns, who's an water analyst at the California Institute for Water Resources in the University of California. She's going to speak on trauma in slow and fast natural disasters, varied perspectives and responses. Faith is a scientist and communication specialist with UC's California Institute for Water Resources. She earned her bachelor's degree from Northern Arizona University and her doctoral degree at UC Berkeley. She has worked at the Ecological Society of America, the U.S. Department of State, a wildlife center at UC Berkeley, and the Pew Charitable Trust. After many years working on contentious and emotionally charged scientific issues, she has become convinced that relational skills, particularly the ability to listen deeply and contend with conflict, are vital. In addition to journal articles, her work has been published at The Conversation, Newsweek, New Republic, BBC, and On Being. Faith.
See if I can get mine up now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, so yeah, thank you everybody for being here. I've learned so much already today. And I'm gonna be another little fish out of water here, talking in a slightly different way. I think I might be the only person to really focus on trauma instead of resilience today. So with a lot of human health challenges, I think natural disasters can be acute and sort of generally short-lived, or chronic and long-lasting. I'm seeing that sort of play out because I've had this somewhat unique vantage point, having worked as a natural scientist on both wildfire and water, and on drought issues in California. And I also work in the part of the university that is known as cooperative extension. So I do a lot of work directly in communities, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about what I've learned about what trauma-sensitive work as a natural scientist might look like. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of a story. About a dozen years ago, I was a scientist who was sort of just out of graduate school, and I had this pretty career and sort of life-altering experience when I was talking with this man who was crying when he was talking to me at a community workshop that we just had. At the time, I was working in this wildfire research center at UC Berkeley, and we were in this small town in Northern California for what's known as a fire safety demonstration day. And we had just presented information from our research on things that homeowners can do to prevent home loss. So some of the things that Maria was talking about in terms of what NIST works on. And at the time, it really was pretty cutting edge research, basically indicating that houses themselves, not so much defensible space, but the actual structures could be built to withstand wildfire. And from a science perspective, this is pretty straightforward stuff. We had really great research, and we had done a bunch of sort of online tools trying to make this work really accessible. We were doing everything we were supposed to do from a sort of applied research perspective. We were in conversation with local firefighters, communities, the state firefighting agencies, federal, folks at the legislature. We were even working internationally, trying to figure out how to implement some of that work. And at the time, we were also talking about something that's a pretty controversial, something called a stay or go policy, that we were writing a peer-reviewed paper about at the time. And this is a kind of policy that's common in Australia, where instead of evacuating, families are trained and have the opportunity to stay in their house and defend their home and their property during a wildfire. And so this kind of idea of staying with your house as a wildfire kind of rages around you can raise a lot of really literal life and death feelings for people, and definitely for the firefighting community. And as you can imagine, people are also kind of intrigued by it. People kind of have a love-hate relationship with fire in a lot of ways. But this was in 2008, and we were there in the fall, and just a couple months earlier, in June and July, 2 large wildfires were burning in Big Sur on the central part of the coast, and ended up burning about 250,000 acres. And in that same period, 18 wildfire complex started in Mendocino County, ultimately burning another 50,000 acres. And both of those sets of wildfires threatened homes, and communities were being evacuated. Firefighting resources were pretty strained because those weren't the only fires in California. There were 30 more burning at the same time. And people were really emotional, especially in Mendocino County, because they felt that they weren't getting the resources from the state and the feds that they needed. And so, here we were talking to people who just sort of lived through the dilemmas of our research topic. And, some of them were sad and angry, and some of them were mad, and others were really grateful that things hadn't been worse. And so this guy that I was talking to was sort of telling me how powerless he felt about sort of having to leave his house after all this time spent evacuating his animals and his farm equipment. And he was also really unsure that staying would have helped much. But it turned out that the way that we were talking about fire and staying and all these things had re-traumatized him. And that's something that we hadn't even considered as we walked in to give this very intellectual discussion on a Saturday afternoon in Ukiah. So really listening to his story was the first time that I just became pretty acutely aware that my scientific training didn't really prepare me for that kind of situation. And I just sort of started to see that our lack of attention to how people felt was actually really detrimental to them and to us and to our work. And so flash forward 5 years to the start of the California drought. I'm no longer working in a wildfire center. I'm working in a water center at UC. And so I've been working on drought pretty much nonstop for the past 4 years. It's really interesting. So in the beginning, the drought felt like this acute thing. There was a lot of panic. There were all these articles about how much water it takes to make yogurt, grow an almond, grow a grape, like blah, blah, blah. A lot of articles saying things about what if California runs out of water? And one of my favorite quotes was in Grist pretty early on, which just said, enjoy your sunny weather, Californians, because we're all clearly gonna die, right? Like people were feeling pretty apocalyptic about the drought. And I felt pretty excited because I worked for this part of the university, cooperative extension, where we've got county-based presence. We were in almost every county in the state. And so we were able to respond to this disaster pretty swiftly, pretty compassionately. For example, this is a photo from the New York Times. Some colleagues of mine had organized, put together a workshop for ranchers. Ranchers were the group that was sort of the hardest hit when the drought first started. That's because they depend on rain to actually grow feed for their livestock. And so that event was broadcast in 7 counties, brought together academics, practitioners, ranchers, and we continued to do that kind of thing. I mean, we've trained, just in the first year of the drought, probably 10,000 people in person, put together a lot of online tools. And this is really beautiful service, right, from the university. And we have continued to do that kind of thing for what's going on 5 years at this point. So the thing that's interesting to me right now is that we really have sort of moved into what I feel like can only be characterized as a chronic phase of the drought. And there's a lot of drought fatigue happening across the state, yet we continue to really, in many ways, treat the drought as sort of this acute natural disaster with sort of endless headlines about will it rain enough, will it snow enough, will it snow in the right places, is El Nino going to save us, is La Nina coming, it's endless. And so thankfully there are a lot of people that are sort of, doing the hard work on the ground of dealing with some of the things that we've been talking about today in terms of the fact that, there's sort of chronically water insecure communities in California where the drought has really only just sort of exacerbated some underlying problems. And at the same time, what I see is it's really challenging to shift that kind of emergency level work around disasters into dealing with these sort of chronic problems. And so I'm not particularly going to have any answers about it, but I find this really a troubling and challenging place to be working right now. So my question is sort of how do we respond appropriately to different kinds of natural disasters? And again, I'm speaking very much from the perspective of a natural scientist, and so I think my perspective is a little different. But I really feel like in the natural sciences, we are only beginning to understand the role of human trauma in our work, and we are not trained for it in any way. So I think just a deepening of the understanding of the context that we work in, the kinds of multiple traumas that people might be experiencing is really important. And it's sort of an invitation to develop a robust sense of natural disaster impacts. It's wonderful to hear the kinds of things that people are working on, because in some ways it makes me realize even more how limited we've been in terms of dealing with the fallout from the drought, because a lot of it has been focused very much on economic impacts. And so I think it renders invisible a lot of the impacts of the drought in the state. And I'd love to see some further work that expanded that. And so I think for me, in the work I do, it's the question of resilience. I'm not even there yet. It's more a good first step of sort of acknowledging trauma. And in some ways, at least again, where I work in California from a science perspective, I feel like it would be a mistake to sort of leap immediately into resilience without acknowledging how much trauma has been happening, and that we need to sort of be able to communicate about complex environmental issues with a deeper psychological awareness. And I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I think one of the really interesting things to me, watching the drought unfold has just been the politicization and sort of commodification of trauma around the drought, and just sort of who ends up benefiting from narratives of trauma. And that's been something that I think in a chronic disaster over a 5-year period starts to get to be really, really interesting, who has claims to trauma. And so I'm just going to end by saying I find there's this guy named Philip Bromberg who's a really well-known psychoanalyst, and he uses the idea of tsunami as a metaphor in his work on trauma and healing, and says basically that this moment when the tsunami comes is also a place that's most open to healing if we can kind of withstand the tsunami. And I think with natural disasters in California, we're in a good place. There's been a lot of the sort of idea that crisis creates opportunity, and there's been a lot of good stuff that has come from it in a lot of ways. And I think in particular the university has a lot to offer, but I do think that if we could sort of dedicate ourselves to more trauma-sensitive approaches, we might be in better shape. So that's what I've got today.
Thank you, Faith. Yes, we certainly live in a beautiful, resilient state. That I can agree with. Next, we have Michael Antonucci, who heads the Emergency Management Services for San Bernardino County. He's going to speak to us today on the role of local government agencies in disaster response, relief, and resilience. So Mike is the manager of the San Bernardino County Fire Department Office of Emergency Services, County OES, as it is called. He has over 40 years of fire service experience and has been an indispensable member of the urban search and rescue community for over 15 years. He started his career as a firefighter in Northern California and has occupied every fire service-related position at least once since then. My God, how old are you? Prior to joining County OES in 2012, Antonucci served as fire chief for the Upland Fire Department, retiring in 2012. He also served in the Governor's Office of Emergency Services as Assistant Chief for Emergency Management and Disaster Services prior to becoming the Fire Chief for the California City Fire Department, where he served for 8 years. Mike holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Science in Public Administration degree, is actively involved with the California Fire Chiefs Association, and founded the California Fire, EMS, and Disaster Educational Foundation annual conference in California 9 years ago. Mike?
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here and honored, and I hope I can get you some valuable information from a different perspective. I like to say that emergency management is what gives you the data you need from all the disasters that we participate in. I noticed in James' presentation that the darkest area of the United States was San Bernardino County. It's a constant reminder that we deal with disasters on a daily basis in San Bernardino, and he is absolutely right about the unrecorded or the unnoticed disasters that affect property and damage that isn't really meet any criteria for either state or federal assistance. And I like to say that all emergencies are local. And anyway, I don't know why this started here, but we'll go back. Okay, yeah, I think so. Okay, just to let you know, the role of government is defined in Senate Bill 1841, which is the Petrus Bill, which is now in Government Code 8607. And that was when Senator Petrus lost his house in the Oakland Hills fires, and he said, oh, you guys can't keep doing this. You have to have a better system. So he came up with SIMS, which is a Standardized Emergency Management System. And that's what we use. And from that, the federal government took over and added in NIMS from SIMS, and now we deal with NIMS and SIMS. And all the other acronyms that go. Basically, I'm going to just go over this real fast to get to the resilience part. SIMS was developed to improve the information flow between jurisdictions, things that was talked about by our other presenters that really happened and started in California is now going through the rest of the nation. I can say that because I'm from New York, so I'm not prejudiced to California. Coordination between agencies, rapid mobilization and deployment, and tracking of resources and of damages. Basically has 5 levels: field level, local operational area, government level, region, and state. The state of California is divided up into 58 operational areas. San Bernardino County is its own operational area. And when a disaster happens or something happens, you utilize all your local resources from all the cities and towns and county departments that you have available to you. When you exceed those resources, or at what we call drawdown, when you get to drawdown, then you start going to your region. And in our region here in Southern California, it's Los Alamos, which is the governor's office, southern region. And then you request resources, and they go to your neighboring counties to get you the resources you need. When you exceed that, or if they're impacted, let's say a big earthquake, Riverside's impacted because that's our closest neighbor. If Riverside's impacted by the earthquake and they can't help us with resources, then they go to the State Operations Center and they broker resources from non-affected counties to get you the resources you need to respond and to recover, both. A good example of this is the Waterman incident. It wasn't big enough for anything as far as federal or we did get a state declaration of emergency for the county, but we didn't qualify for any resources to come in. But California's mutual aid system allowed us to get environmental health specialists from 7 different counties to come into San Bernardino County until we were able to get our staffing back to where we can operate without them. So it's a really robust system in California, how it works. Just field level, local government level, operational level, regional level. Okay, pre-recovery. These are hazard mitigation plans and THIRAs, which is threat hazard identification and risk reduction. Risk assessment is part of what we deal with and have to report with to the federal government. Hazardous materials or hazardous mitigation plans and THIRAs are required to be able to get reimbursed in a federal declared disaster. If we don't have those, we cannot get any kind of reimbursement for recovery operations or for response recovery operations. Recovery support functions. This is what we do daily. We have 4 open recoveries right now. We have Waterman incident that's still in recovery, which is a terrorism incident. We have the drought that we keep dealing with every year. That's open recovery for dry wells and pipelines that we have. We have the pilot fire, which happened in the mountains of San Bernardino County, and we have the Blue Cut fire, which happened in the Cajon Valley. All those are up right now, and we're doing the recovery of things I'm speaking of right now. That's the planning and capacity building, economics, social, health and social services, housing, infrastructure systems, and natural and cultural resources, which was all a task in these fires and these events. Planning and capacity building. Basically, we work with our partners. Debra will talk a little bit about that in her next presentation, but in a disaster, I work very closely with Debra because with the community resources, the businesses and the faith-based groups are the ones that come in and do the things that government can't do. And they make it go faster. We are caught up in red tape. Somebody I was talking to earlier said the goal of emergency management in their state is kind of handed off in 3 days. I don't remember who that was, to the privates. That doesn't work in California like that. It takes probably 6 months just to get through the red tape to be able to get to the point where you've cleared all the hurdles to get to the point where you can hand it off to the local groups. They can work with you during it, but you can't give up your authority or responsibility to clear the things. For instance, 105 houses burned down on the Blue Cut fire. Of those 105 houses that burnt down, we couldn't let anybody start rebuilding or clearing their debris until after we got asbestos clearance for each one of those properties. Now, a lot of those property owners are in poverty. They own their houses outright. They didn't have any insurance. There's no mechanism for them to be able to call an insurance company up and say, hey, my house burned down, you need to clear the debris off, which is part of your insurance policy. So the county had to we hired a asbestos vendor that went through and is still going through the 105 properties that burnt down, and they have to test the materials, send it to a lab to make sure that those components that was burnt do not have asbestos, so that we can clear the debris and put it in a landfill. If it has asbestos, then it has to be handled in a special way, and all this is a block to people recovering, all the regulations. But unfortunately, we have to go by these regulations for the overall safety of the public, because obviously we don't want asbestos going everywhere and contaminating water and contaminating other things. Lead has the same issues with lead. So we promote mitigation and reconstruction activities, which, as I said, we're doing right now. We reestablished the parks and the recreational centers and entertainment for the communities. The reunite families. We have family assistance centers that we have to reunite couples. You know, we evacuated 82,500 people from the Blue Cut fire, and we had a new system that we've just gone to called a SHOC. It's a Shelter Operations Compound. And our theory behind this, through research, is showed that we can't get people to go to shelters. And the reason why we can't get people to go to shelters is because they don't have the services that they need at those shelters. They're usually run by Red Cross, and they can get food and they can get water and they get a cot to sleep in, but what other services are they getting? So we have come up with this plan, and this was the first time we used it very successfully, and it's starting to spread over the nation as the model, and that's putting one-stop shopping. We have children's services, we have mental health services, we have our county hospital services, we have all these services along with a co-located animal shelter, because we found out through research again that people will stay in their car and sleep with their animal because they can't bring them in a Red Cross shelter. So we co-locate animal shelters with the human shelter so they can take care of their animals, feed them, play with them, but when it's time to sleep, they go to the animal shelter, they go to the human shelter, and then they can start it all over again in the morning. So all of this has been launched because of the needs of the different groups within the county that we have and the different ways of approaching sheltering operations and getting people to evacuate. We still, even today, have about a 50% evacuation rate. When we tell people to evacuate, about 50% of the people will go and 50% of the people will stay. And that's a problem. We burned over 2 engine companies in the Blue Cut fire because they had to make rescues to people. And you know, when you're making rescues of people that haven't evacuated, who's putting out the fire? So it's a large issue, and I understand the reasoning behind it because you can't force somebody to leave. Even under a mandatory evacuation, all you can do is say it's a mandatory evacuation, leave, and go on to the next one. And if they don't want to leave, that's it. You can't arrest them. You can't do anything like that. So people don't want to leave because once they leave, they can't come back, because that's when you can enforce it. You have the roadblocks, and you won't let them back in. So they don't want to evacuate and not go back into the house. So it's a lot of issues, and building that resilience to not only let them have the trust that they can get back in a quickly manner after the emergency's over, but that they can come back with the services they want has been kind of in the shock concept. And we have a local assistance center in the shock, so they can talk to federal, FEMA, Small Business Association, county assessor's office. They can get all those services they need right there to kind of encourage them to evacuate to that, because they're going to get the services they need. And short-term recovery we deal with, and that's the medical, food, water, shelter, family reunification, mental health needs, animal care, volunteering, but limited until we get everything cleared, and then, of course, mass fatality mitigation when that occurs. And then where we put them. This is the different places that they go: hospitals, shelters, open spaces, stadiums, back to schools. That's all the different places that we shelter people in a disaster when you're dealing about large numbers of mass sheltering. And then long-term recovery we have to deal with, and we have to think about the business and economic recovery, the government business continuities, the reestablishing the parks, like I said before. And this is where the organizing VOAD and the churches and schools and all those other faith-based groups that Debra will talk about come into play, because they really take a big load off of us and help us be able to get the services they need to the people outside of the government bureaucracy that kind of holds up things. And I'm out of time. There's so much on this presentation. It's like 2 hours alone just on this. But with that, we'll defer to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I think all the panelists, I'm sorry, have felt pressed for time. But I think many of the issues that each of you want to discuss will come up in the Q&A, so you'll get a chance to bring them up later. And it is now my pleasure to invite the last, but certainly not the least panelist of the day, Debra Williams, who's president of the nonprofit organization here in Riverside. It is in Riverside, right? Not in Redlands. It's called Building Resilient Communities, and she's going to talk to us about engaging the whole community. A brief background on Debra. She is the president of Building Resilient Communities, as I just said, a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to providing education and training programs for community and faith-based organizations in the areas of disaster preparedness and economic resilience. She leads the Christian Disaster Relief Coalition, which is a network of churches that are fully trained and qualified to provide various services when a disaster strikes. The coalition was activated by the FBI to provide childcare services for the families of the victims after the San Bernardino terrorist shooting. Debra currently serves as the vice chair and faith-based liaison of San Bernardino County Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, VOAD. She has the honor of also serving as the faith-based liaison for the city of Rancho Cucamonga and is responsible for coordinating their donations management program. She has published several books and curricula, including Preparing for a Disaster, a Call to Action ebook, as well as Preparing Your House of Worship for a Disaster Toolkit, and various other books and articles. With that, could I invite Debra to come to the stage and give a 10-minute presentation, and then we'll all the panelists will come and sit here and entertain questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Let's see now, can I get out of here? I'm really honored to be here this afternoon and to hear all of the different speakers. All right, cool. To hear all of the different speakers has been really wonderful. I think Mike said that he provides the data to all of you so that you can do your research, right? And then I use all of the research that that you create so that we can actually put words to what we do on the ground. So I'm going to be talking with you about how to engage the whole community. And when I think about resilience, I look at resilience as kind of the, you know, it's the outcome, it's the end game of what you want to have. And we are actually in the trenches. Let's see if I can get this on here. Okay, all right. So we are actually in the trenches trying to get the communities to that level of being resilient, all right? We don't tell them we're trying to get them to be resilient. We tell them that we are casting a safety net across all of San Bernardino and Riverside County, and that it's going to take everybody to do that. I want to make one point from this slide. We not only do work in disaster preparedness, but we also focus on economic resilience. And I was glad to hear a few people kind of broaden the definition of resilience earlier today, because we are really looking at how the economy changed in 2008 and how it greatly impacted all of the communities, and that is a disaster. And so one half of our house is working on that economic resilience, and I would love to see somebody do some sort of a summit on economic resilience. How do you apply resilience to people who have been greatly impacted by the economy? So that's just my plug for another conference on that. But we do work across Riverside and San Bernardino County. Do I not know what I'm doing? Probably. Okay, I got it. All right, so when we look at resilience, we're looking at the whole community. You know the concept of it takes a village, right? It takes everybody. And when we are focusing on whole community, these are the various groups that we are looking at. We want everybody to come to the table because we know it's going to take everybody. It's going to take all of you in education. And so I'm really happy to see all of the things and hear all the things that you're doing. Some people have asked me, why do you have philanthropy on there? Well, because we need the money. You know, somebody has to fund everything that is happening, and a lot of the nonprofits, they don't have the money. So we invite everybody to the table. What's the benefit of having that whole community? Well, I think to a great degree, Mike just talked a little bit about it. Government can only play one role. And when they are gone, whatever period of time that is, who's going to be left? It's going to be the faith-based community. It's going to be business. It's going to be education. It's going to be everybody else that's going to be staying there and making sure that that community is going to come back, that they're actually going to be able to recover. So when you include all those different organizations or all those different groups, then you're going to have a shared understanding of what the needs are in the community. There are populations that we found because of the Blue Cut fire here in San Bernardino County that in reality, a lot of people didn't know they were even there. So it's the community that really understands what the risks are, what the needs are, and then even what the capabilities are. When you bring everybody to the table, then you can talk about what are all the resources that do exist, and how do we capitalize and utilize all of those different resources and not duplicate efforts. Let me give you an example. The Moore, Oklahoma fire. Even though we're sitting out here in California, a lot of the faith-based community that I work with, they just want to help. They want to help anywhere that they can. And I remember sitting in a congregation and listening to their pastor talk about how they literally had sent 4 people on an airplane to Moore, Oklahoma, with blank checks and credit cards from the church. Now, this was a mega church. And they sent them there to knock on doors of churches in Moore, Oklahoma, didn't know the people, had no relationship with them or anything, and they were telling them, what do you need? What do you need? They rented a truck, and they went to the local Home Depot or wherever it was, and they bought those things. And the entire congregation, they were clapping, hallelujah, oh, that's wonderful. And I'm sitting there, and I'm almost like screaming, why would you do that? Because they don't necessarily understand the process. So education is key when you're including the entire community. They need to know how they fit in, what their role can be. You're going to have greater resilience if you do that. Some of the challenges, we do work a lot with the faith-based community. I mentioned to the group at lunch, we work with community and faith-based organizations. But I will tell you that we have so much work to do with the faith-based organizations that we really haven't even had an opportunity to scratch the surface of working with the other nonprofits that are not faith-based, like the food banks that have contacted us and said, can you come in and can you help us to prepare? We have not had time. That's how much work there is. Just in San Bernardino County alone, we've identified 900 houses of worship. And we know there are that many in Riverside County as well. They are all going to go out and help. The one thing you need to know about the community, they are going to help. The key is, are they organized? Are they trained? Do they understand their role? Do they have relationships with each other as well as with the rest of the whole community, like local government? That's what's important. Most of them, because they haven't had a lot of training or no understanding of disaster services or cycle at all, they are what we call spontaneous volunteers. And that's not always good, because they can get themselves into a lot of trouble. So what we do then is we go out and we actually work with the houses of worship. Now, I say houses of worship instead of churches because it could be temples, synagogues, mosques, churches. It could be the entire faith-based community. We know that 60% of people in the United States are actually going to go to their house of worship or a faith leader initially, and that in low-income and immigrant communities, it's going to be even higher than that. So what better place to start with your resiliency efforts than with the faith-based community? So we go in, we work with the houses of worship, we help them get prepared their business themselves, prepare their staff, their volunteers. We go in and set up emergency teams within the houses of worship. We help them prepare the families that they are working with that are members, and then also their surrounding community. And we work with the youth. Now, I have some information in the back. I brought information for you. And so I have some flyers back there that you can take with you that talk about some of our programs. I just really quickly, though, Mike touched on VOAD, Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. And so I want to touch on VOAD because if you are not familiar with voluntary organizations active in disaster, you need to be. And let me tell you why. They are a huge support system for the community to be resilient. And they work in all phases of the disaster cycle. So the reason I work with Mike Antonucci is because Building Resilient Communities is part of San Bernardino County VOAD. We are also part of Riverside County VOAD, and we are members of SoCal VOAD. So that means that we actually could be activated by San Bernardino County to come in and provide the services. And we're going to go through all of the churches that we work with because they've been trained in incident command system. They've had CPR first aid AED training. The child care center that I mentioned that the FBI had us come in and work, that was all through VOAD. So I would encourage you to start in the community. You ask, where do you start with resiliency? I would say start with your faith-based community because they touch everybody. Okay? Thank you.
So could I invite the other three panelists to come to the table here in front, and we will now begin the Q&A portion of the presentation. It's 3:30, so we have a good half an hour to go. Who wants to break the ice with the first question? Yes, David.
I have a question for both Debra and Michael, which is if Maria came to you and said, I've got the community resilience toolkit that I'd like you to do here, I'm kind of curious, number one, which one of you would jump up and say, I want to do it? Okay, we have an answer. And what would the other one who did not jump up say? And how reasonable do you think it would be to be able to carry that out, sustain it, and engage in the activities? And do you think it would be a useful exercise?
Well, I would think that it would be a very useful exercise. I would embrace the opportunity to work with Debra to,
What would happen?
as I told you, in government it's slower. So I would embrace Debra taking it on and us working with her like we do right now with the VOADs to
Give it to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
You did raise your hand.
I did.
And I played on that. But yes, and incorporate it into the county structure. I think if it's tested and she's doing it, then I can incorporate it very easily.
And we actually, Mike, already have probably a forum to start that with the. We do a summit every year, a one-day summit with one of the state senators, and we bring whole community together. And so I think that would be a really great way to launch it, and there's no way we would do it by ourselves because we only work on whole community. So Mike's organization would have to be involved. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
I know they would go out to, for example, to help with disasters, earthquakes in China and some other places. They may adopt to Katrina and
Yes.
affected areas as well. So I think it may be, I don't know, Mike. It's always they would have to do the kind of outreach.
They have. You're talking about Tai Chi?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Okay.
Yeah,
worked
you're-
with them already.
Yeah, you're talking about Buddhist Suchi Foundation, and they have 6 million volunteers all over the world. They are some of our best friends. We work with them constantly. They were on the Blue Cut Fire. They actually planned to provide financial aid for all 105 properties. I think they probably provided financial aid to maybe 28 to 30 of those families. They are fabulous. We work with them all the time. Mm-hmm.
Rancho California crew. To all four speakers. disaster that in Southern California we're not prepared for yet?
We'll let the locals go first.
Well, I can only go back to what we're lacking in training, and that would be the thing that impacted us the most, even though it was one of the smallest events I've done, was the Waterman terrorism incident. That has deep roots that is still affecting the county almost a year later. And I think that as a nation, we're not really prepared. Terrorism is not a local, it has not been a local problem. It's been a federal problem. And now it's becoming a local problem. And I don't think that we have, although it's a disaster in itself, it has circumstances and moving parts that are not like any other disaster. And I think that would be our biggest challenge right now. We do shakeout, we prepare for the floods, we prepare for the earthquake, we give everybody the education that they need on those things, but we're just now scratching the surface of terrorism locally.
From my seat, I would say the next disaster, whatever it is. But the reason I say that is local government, I mean, they've been doing this a very, very long time. They are very prepared. The groups that I work with, the faith-based community, the not regular nonprofits, they are still grappling with the idea that they should be doing something. They think it's government's job to do it. So we are still educating. When you see blue skies out there, they think that there's no disaster, but that doesn't mean there isn't a disaster somewhere in the community. When Mount Baldy flood hit, we tried to get the faith-based community to come out and help with debris removal, and you know, if it wasn't in their backyard, they didn't see why they needed to help. So I would say that it's still a whole community framework for disaster emergency management is still so new to the rest of the world, you know, besides government, that I would say the next disaster.
Just an observation and then a pitch a bit. I met recently with our county judge, who is the one who oversees the Office of Emergency Management in Houston. And from that perspective, the hardest disaster to plan for is the terrorist attack. So he was also echoing the same sentiment. How do you plan for that? Where is it going to be? What do you do? Because it's a cultural event. It's going to be in a high sort of populated space. And so I think all these things merit attention. What I'd argue for is the disaster that's chronic and happening all the time that doesn't get the play. And so that's one of the pieces of this puzzle that our research was trying to get at, that actually this stuff is going on all the time. So there are natural hazards that are flooding a place here and there, and the social vulnerabilities are there, but the water recedes, and because it didn't make the spectacular disaster front page, it was just a 2-day flood, people forget that actually, you know, there are a few thousand people here who just lost their housing, and or the units that are there are now removed from the affordable housing supply, and so that is increasing rent and displacing people. And what our research is trying to show is that you can have a lot of small things that fly under the radar, and that's in fact the majority of things that happen, very unspectacular, that happen, you know, again, on average 5 times a year in the given county, 20 million on average every year, and you just keep adding that up, and it has people who are climbing, I think the metaphor earlier, climbing the ladder, you know, fall down and not be able to participate in the resilience community and do things. And I think that's the one we're least prepared for, the one that doesn't get the attention.
I think it's noteworthy just to mention that the state of California, to qualify for federal aid, it's got to reach a threshold of $52 million in damage. Under that, they're not even going to talk to you.
Yeah, so I guess I would probably focus on something that's, you know, sort of not even in Southern California per se, but I think this idea of chronic, not in the sense you're talking about of sort of these small unnoticed disasters, but things like drought and what I talked about in terms of that we just don't know how to deal with these long-term changes, and what people kind of want to talk about as the new normal, which is perhaps the old normal, in terms of water scarcity, and its coincidence with things like tree die-offs in the Sierras, and the fact that our snowpack is exceedingly small these days, and sort of we just aren't prepared for the large kind of infrastructure changes that would need to happen around water supply, particularly in Southern California. And it's not specific to Southern California because your water comes from other parts of the state.
Or states.
Or states, as the case may be, yes.
Yes.
Trevor Clark from the Materials Engineering program in the Engineering College here at UC Riverside. A lot of speakers are commenting on the need for interdisciplinary teams in both the planning and execution of the building. So I'm wondering, what are some of the things that engineers specifically would think about or would be helpful for them to keep in mind, and how would you go about maybe some methods for unifying these ideas or better communication between engineers and social science and economics?
Well, first of all, come to conferences like this. So I applaud you for doing that and keeping the dialogue open. As someone who is probably less experienced in this than some of the colleagues who might be able to answer this as well from earlier in the panels, I can tell you I just started working with some engineers and hydrologists in Houston. One of the big concerns we have is the ship channel there, which is about 50 miles long, and it's actually the largest petrochemical infrastructure, certainly in the country, some argue in the world. And what we're concerned about is how you bring a lot of different people together on this issue or this challenge. So what we're trying to do is to sit around a table and problem solve, and then get data, have a conversation, develop a common language, and move that out into the communities. So what we've done is this, okay, how are we going to scope the problem? So what we decided to focus on was petrochemical, they call them tank farms. So because the price of oil and gasoline is so low, people are sitting on that oil. Companies are sitting on that oil. So we have billions of gallons of petrochemical and toxins lined up along a water space that is susceptible to hurricane pressure. So we've put together data to see how those tank farms have grown over time, how they would be compromised, where the water would go, who lives in that space, and try to begin organizing with community members. But I think the most important thing is to sit down. We look at each other with crossed eyes sometimes, the sociologists and engineers, like, really, that's what you call risk? You know, it's the structural integrity. It's like, no, it's a political act, and we go back and forth. And we agree to disagree and move forward, and we write papers together, and I put things in there, and they go, no, you can't say that. And I say, is that all you have? And we go back and forth. But I think this is what we need to do, is to continue to have the conversations. A lot of it is learning how to, I think, invent the wheel in some respects, but locally, so that people talk about vulnerabilities and resilience in context. This is trying to problem solve and build community in a context that then leads out as well. And I think that's going to be done somewhat idiosyncratically by who's at the table and who's doing what. But I encourage you to, keep giving it an effort, and, go out and have a beer with the sociologist occasionally, and we'll do the same, and, we'll see what we can do from there.
Actually, I would say get involved. Engineers, get involved. And when I say that, I'm thinking about the youth program that we have, where we are getting the youth to go through workshops and learning labs on disaster preparedness to understand how to take care of themselves, their families, and when they're in the community and things like that. But we're incorporating STEM in that. And we're also looking at what are those STEM careers that could be connected to emergency management. And so I would say get involved. Maybe think broader, career-wise, about how you could impact what's happening in emergency management. Just the fact that you're saying that it's a difficult discussion. It's an uncomfortable discussion because you haven't collaborated before. Get involved. Make your voice heard.
There's a group. California has 8 urban search and rescue teams, the most in the nation. Any other state only has 2. And in these urban search and rescue teams, they have a specialist engineering positions in this. And they have a group statewide that they go around and they participate in damage assessment teams. They go and participate in planning of how to bridge certain temporary facilities when something happens, and also on standards and codes. That would be my entry port in for you, I would think, is get involved. You have one real local here in Riverside. Riverside City has a state-sponsored urban search and rescue team, so you can tie into them really quick and really easy and get into that group.
I have a question for James. I'm sorry, it just stepped out, so I don't know if someone has asked you this question already, but I was intrigued by your empirical analysis, so trying to explain the number of modes. What sort of prompted you to use that particular dependent variable? In other words, I can see the number of moves as a proxy for housing instability. But beyond that, are there not better measures of the negative impact of an hazard, a natural hazard? I'm sort of wondering, I understand that you sort of control for a lot of factors that would normally be associated with housing instability, such as age and demographic characteristics of the individual or household, and you're trying to control for that, and then looking on top, once you control for that, what's the impact of the natural hazard? But I'm sort of curious, what's your hypothesis that, in a sense, should policymakers be trying to keep this housing instability down? Is that the objective?
Excellent question, because we do skirt the question of whether or not that instability is good and bad, or good or bad, and that can be a very differential sort of outcome for different groups. So what we try to do, and maybe this is getting in more to trying to change some of the language and the perspective we have within the academy, but what we were trying to do is move the conversation, at least in sociology, away from an event-centered perspective. So we wanted to bring in the field of social stratification and social inequality. And so we notice in that literature there's been growing attention to concerns about residential instability with respect to low-income affordable housing issues, evictions, and people who are forced to move. So we saw that on one side, and in the disaster literature there's quite a bit of concern about environmental migration generally in a global sense, but also dislocation from housing problems with respect to these hazards. So we wanted to find a common space to look at these things and begin to link them. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that housing instability, particularly for single-parent households, low-income, and minority communities where the move itself is detrimental to all sorts of things with respect to mental health, educational outcomes, and these types of things. So part of it was an empirical question, whether or not that was lining up with the types of population indicators that we thought it might. And that's in fact what we found, that the groups that we thought might be more vulnerable were experiencing more instability with the natural hazard increase. But you're right, it's just the beginning of it, and we don't have a sense of, again, there's a question, especially coming out of the Katrina research, where maybe some of that housing instability could lead towards an outcome where people end up in better neighborhoods. Then you get into the qualitative questions that were raised earlier. Well, just because you end up in a better neighborhood, quote unquote, by these certain indicators, are you being incorporated within that neighborhood, and how does that work? So we're scratching the surface, but we still believe that taking a longitudinal perspective on this is important. And one of the things that we found in some supplemental analyses that are still very early is this divergence hypothesis that people have pointed to, but the more you have inequality in a county and the more it experiences these hazard impacts over time, the more inequality you have coming out of that, because the people who have the wherewithal to insure their property and do things actually oftentimes do better after these events. Those who don't do worse. And so we're looking at divergence in segregation outcomes, inequalities, and income distributions and these sorts of things.
No, I mean, I think the approach is brilliant, and that's what we should be moving toward. But I wonder whether something like, since you have you're using NLSY and KCS data, I wonder if you might, in the future, be looking at indicators like student achievement or student success, because to the extent that these natural hazards sort of cause dislocation, which causes students to interrupt their schooling or causes performance in schools to degrade, that would be a significant negative impact. And so I think what your analysis and the use of the kind of longitudinal approach that you take, that sort of opens up, you could think of a whole host of dependent variables that you could analyze with using your methodology.
Yeah, we agree. We've got a long road ahead of us, but we're eager to do it. One of the things I will say that we wanted to get into with respect to some of the earlier panelists was bringing in data on organizations and social capital, as poorly measured as it might be, and look at how the context of, if you have a certain density of faith-based organizations or other types of NGOs, does that moderate or otherwise influence the impacts of the natural hazards on these types of outcomes, whether it's residential instability, health outcomes, education outcomes, but how can we begin to think about what the community can do in terms of organizing that might influence or insert itself in here? But agreed. Bruce, I mean, not the, I'll point. I didn't, Bruce.
Okay, so I wanted to see if I could get Jim and Faith and David in a conversation. So David told us this morning that if we can really do a good job of capturing the nature of the exposure, we can make the effect of the event go away, maybe, and that's what he's interrogating. But I would, listening to both of you, I would say that the kinds of things that you're looking at, it wouldn't work for. So for the natural hazards, they just seem so different in the sense of how we respond to them. They're just kind of like, we don't have a big natural response to them. So that would likely make the same exposure be different because of how we responded to it. And Faith's distinction between slow and fast disasters, you'd think that those kinds of disasters are just so different that their consequences couldn't be the same. Because one's a sharp thing and the other just kind of going on, we kind of take it for granted. And I don't know, what do you think?
Actually, could I start? Because I feel like somebody asked before about ACE, the adverse childhood experiences, and I feel like there's a dose-response relationship that you guys were actually describing, and you showed, I thought, pretty clearly, which was, as the dose increases, there's actually a split based on those who are most vulnerable, so there's an interaction between dose and some form of vulnerability or something structural that's beginning to split and lead to worse outcomes, which in this case would be housing instability. And so it actually fits pretty nicely that I would say, regardless of what the event was, it's the accumulation of disadvantage or the accumulation of trauma, stressors, et cetera, that may even have a threshold effect that is mediated by something structural or some vulnerability.
Okay.
So, and I would agree, because David's a smart guy. And that's what we're trying to get at. And we haven't teased it out as much as we could, but the interactions are there, and what we're trying to show is basically you can get it all at once, or you can get it gradually over time, and you would expect a very big difference. And so some of the difference might be that, the big event plays out longer and sort of has that sort of trajectory, whereas the accumulation of smaller hazards, it's just sort of this boom, 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 and you don't notice it as much. And maybe the mechanisms by which it happens vary. For us, we're inferring the mechanisms. For us, we believe that even if your housing isn't impacted, if there is housing in an area that can have indirect effects in terms of changing the housing market, particularly the housing market that's not incentivized to provide for affordable housing and for low-income residents. And that trickles forward. And again, that can just be the serial movement that speeds up things. But we're interested in how that works as well. and I'm intrigued by the chronic and acute because I can't disentangle it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a helpful way to think to a certain extent, and then once you get really into it, it's like, this is really hard to separate. But I do think that I was intrigued by David's results because I think, it does resonate, at least on the surface, in terms of, when we talk about water scarcity, for example, in California, there's been, related to the drought, a lot of attention paid to a couple towns that have, dry wells at this point. And a lot of that has been talked about in the context of drought as a natural disaster. But when that has been interrogated further, a lot of it has become, well, that's this chronic water insecurity problem that has much more to do with disenfranchisement and poverty levels and the fact that they're in these unincorporated towns. And so it's not even really a drought issue. And so I was kind of, it's interesting for me to think on that level of, does poverty kind of explain? And I've heard people talk about that in California quite a bit. It's like, are we actually talking about water, or are we talking about other things here? And then the other piece that I guess I've been struggling with today is also just these issues of sort of marginalized or invisible communities and how much, so in your data, it's kind of like, there probably are these generalizations, but then there might be these cases, especially around these particularly invisible communities that don't show up in things like that. So that's my, concern about that.
This is for Debra and Michael, if you get the chance. So after the oil spill, we were interested in communities and trying to measure the social capital, and we came across BOADs, but not every county operated a BOAD. And it seemed to be like the ones that were successful in doing it were the ones that were just better off to start out with. They were the wealthier ones, they had more people, population density was higher, and so we didn't really sort of follow that chain of thought. But my question is, what makes your BOAD work well? Is it the fact that it's well-staffed, well-resourced, or is there something else that's out there that you see as working well?
Okay, so let me compare Riverside to San Bernardino County VOAD, and the structures are totally different. None of them are nonprofits. They're not 501c3. So they are umbrella coordinating bodies for all of the various agencies. San Bernardino, I think, works really well because San Bernardino County is broken up into regions because it's so large. And so we have what we call COADs. So community organizations active in disasters. And so we have 7 COADs that make up the VOAD. And so, I know, acronyms. So I think the really unique thing about that is that each of the COADs can understand their region, the hazards that they have, the local populations, what their resources are, and they can function really independently of other COADs if they had to. So I think about Big Bear up in the mountains. They could be isolated and nobody maybe could, as we say, get up the hill. Get up there to them. And so their COAD has prepared itself in such a way that they will utilize all of the local resources, and the other COADs are kind of mutual aid, right? So I think that's the great benefit of San Bernardino County. And then we have a pretty strong leadership team right now, and we are partnering well with OES, and we are getting into SIMS and NIMS and ICS and all the other acronyms. So I think that's the benefit with San Bernardino County. Riverside County, I think for the way that Riverside County operates, the structure is really good. It's a VOAD. All the agencies belong to the VOAD. It's not broken down. And we have a really strong relationship with Riverside County OES. And so I think a lot of it is that partnership. It's whether or not they are actually invited to the table. In both counties, we have a seat in the Emergency Operations Center. That's huge. I don't think San Diego VOAD still doesn't have a seat in their EOC. And so that relationship and building those partnerships well in advance, that's really critical.
Part of the need for the COAD structure, besides the VOADs, is because we are the largest county in the United States. And with 22,000 square miles of everything, we have everything but an ocean. We have, lakes, we have mountains, we have desert, we have metro areas, and we have the second poorest city outside of Detroit in San Bernardino City, who's claimed bankruptcy. And I think all that structure has required us to break it down into that, because you can't cover it just with a VOAD. You need to have the COADs to handle the day-to-day minor stuff like you were talking about that doesn't make headlines and news.
Did you say 22,000?
Yeah.
22,000.
Yeah.
And now you know why I look old.
You just humbled the
Does that answer your question?
Hi, my name is Michael Hadley. I'm from Western Municipal Water District here in Riverside County. I'm the Government Affairs Officer. Is there anything that the state or the federal level can do besides provide more funding to help mitigate these kind of disasters or help the causes of community, or is there legislatively anything that they can do in any of your opinions?
For any specific type of disaster, period, which I'm working right now with Washington and some senators trying to get legislation passed to define the responsibility of terrorism and the ability to help first responders. The Waterman incident has cost us $25 million. There is zero funding available for it, except if you're a victim, then DOJ kicks in with victim services, and they do have help for that. Between the workers' comp and between the first response, there is a DOJ grant for first response, and it's capped at $500,000. San Bernardino City alone, their first response was $561,000. And then you have the sheriffs and the other 350 cops that came in to assist in the manhunt. So I am working with them to try to get some sort of legislation to be able to define whose responsibility is it for terrorism acts that's declared terrorism by the FBI. So other than that, they are working with the hazard mitigation programs and trying to make incentives, insurance incentives and other ways to be able to say, hey, if you're in this hazard zone, you need to mitigate it in some way, shape, or form to be able to be eligible for federal funding. And if you're in those areas that have recurring emergencies like floodings, it's floods every year, we'll buy your property, you need to relocate someplace else.
Did you say without more money?
Philanthropy.
Well, I mean, honestly, really, putting more grants out there for preparedness would be really helpful. As we look for grants from the federal government, their response and recovery, they're for cities and counties and states and, things like that. And so even talking with FEMA, I'm constantly saying, can you put some kind of grant funding out there for preparedness? That would help a lot. The other thing that I mentioned earlier was helping to establish some standards. I'm actually surprised at the things that don't exist. We talked about some standards. There are now standards for homes, building homes, but for houses of worship, give them some incentive to prepare and do a recertification every year or every 3 years or whatever. Those are the kinds of things that I am constantly raising my hand and saying, we need this desperately. Okay, they did do EMI, Emergency Management Institute, EMI, did do something that I think is really wonderful. They just developed a workshop or a curriculum on whole community. And even though that idea has been out since Katrina, after Katrina, a lot of people still don't understand nationally the concept of whole community. And so getting the word out about it takes a village, it takes everybody. They do have the workshop now. We participated in developing that workshop. I served as a subject matter expert on it. And so I'm hoping that they will really get that out to the emergency managers across the nation. So.
And I haven't thought too deeply about this, and it's probably hazard specific, but just on the affordable housing aspect, I mean, one of the things we were talking about over lunch is both the private insurance market and the government spending typically is to restore property and not community. And I get the fact that, you know, having more money to help put into community is an important thing, and we need to do that. I guess with the housing, particularly, I would shine the light on rentership and having a little bit more protection there. So some of the lessons that we drew on in this research actually came from the Loma Prieta quake and the Northridge quake, where they found that, you know, oftentimes predatory landlords use the opportunity in this crisis basically to evict people on rent day, because it happened on rent day, and then be able to keep the deposit and or get around any rent control aspects. So, you know, extending it, I don't know if it's a hotline or some sort of consideration of you know, an eviction-free period after an event, or some sort of, you know, community group that sort of looks for how to protect renters, because they're the most vulnerable. They're the ones who are going to be at the whim of people who are going to use the property and insurance game to their oftentimes advantage, and think about that. So that, and just, you know, if you're going to extend it, I don't know how to do this. This is complicated. But one of the things I was curious about when we first did our study of Katrina and talking to African-American men in particular, but looking at the data, a lot of them stayed behind, of course, to, you know, keep their housing from being damaged because they owned it outright and couldn't afford the insurance. But a lot of them also stayed because of their employment precarity. They were, it turns out, 8 to 10 times more likely than white counterparts at the same income level to be fired from their job if they didn't stick around, if, you know, the employment came up and was running again. So some sort of short-term protection, that doesn't cost a lot of money, that protects low-income workers and low-income renters from being displaced.
On that note, I think we should let the panel sort of go.
What does he have in store?
What are you trying to say? And thank you very much for a very interesting and thoughtful panel session. And we will now move to the last part of the day's proceedings. Do you want to sort of preside over that? I guess what we decided was Bruce Link, one of our conference organizers, is going to try to do the unenviable task of summing up the day's proceedings. And maybe we can do this as an interactive session where you give us a few ideas on what you think we have learned and what you have learned from the day's proceedings, and then we can sort of chime in.
Sounds great. So could we put on the lights? I've got this fear of being a shady character. Because I won't be using, how does this thing work?
It is a little unstable.
Great. So I had a quip I was going to start out with to kind of like energize us. But I realized that that quip was going to put me into not a win-win, but a lose-lose situation. The reason that that would be is that if there's the quip I would give, it'd be at high risk of already coming up during the day, in which case its novelty would be lost. On the other hand, if the quip didn't come up, it would maybe not be a very good quip, and I shouldn't use it anyway. So
it was kind of a lose-lose. But now I've motivated it for you, so I'll give it, even though it has come up. So maybe it does have a little bit of interest or validity. And that is, you can imagine us organizers of this session having some kind of a malevolent crystal ball looking to the future and seeing what was going to happen tomorrow. And that's why we scheduled a conference on disaster preparedness the day before the election. No matter what your politics are, somebody's going to think it's a disaster. But before you get any conspiracy theories about that and our ability to do that, it was a total coincidence. It just happened that we scheduled it on this day. So now getting to the day, I wanted to step back first and just think about our university and some of our ambitions maybe. And one of the reasons I've been here only for a year, but one of the reasons I really like being here. And I think this conference kind of represents some of that. So one thing about it is it's this joint effort between arts and sciences and the School of Public Policy. And, maybe that happens because the deans like each other and, that got it going. But on the other hand, it's something that we're wanting to do here, to bring together people from different perspectives and see things with different lenses and bring out new stuff by doing it. Also, it involves the community. So that's something else we're trying to do at Riverside to be more community relevant. It also targets a real world issue, so something that matters beyond what people think in ivory towers. It's something that could happen to us, so I like that element of it. And then finally, it's forward-looking. So it's kind of like I like all those things about what this was. And I really want to thank all the people who came and talked because they helped us make that happen in a way that was really interesting and fun. So I'm going to say 4 things that I really stuck out for me. And they won't capture it all, but there are 4 things. And the first one was, I'm going to call it conceptual mapping. So that to think about this issue of disaster and resiliency, we really need concepts to be able to talk about it in the complexity that it presents us with. And I got a lot of that today. So around resilience, we started off with Maria's general overview and gave us a really comprehensive way of thinking about resilience. But then we also developed twists later on with Fernando and Brian with the idea that resilience as a capacity to change. And I thought what an interesting idea that was. So those stuck out for me with respect to resilience. Then with respect to disaster, I came in thinking about disasters as these great big things. But I was changed a little bit by some of the talks focus on just the quotidian things that happen to people. So we had that talk about homelessness as a disaster. And the idea that, we make the conditions that make homelessness happen, and then our portrayal of them as people in the news media and stuff, kind of like reinforces that horrible disaster for them. And then Jim gave the idea of normal hazards that, and I hadn't really thought about that either. So that filling out of a conceptual map about disasters was something that really came through for me. And then faith, slow and fast, and David's, can we get how the impact is so that even though all of these things are coming from different places, they have the same equifinality in their consequences. So all of that was super interesting to me around conceptual mapping. And I learned a lot from that. The other thing I really loved about it was the multiple methods. So we had the qualitative with Fernando and Brian. We had the quantitative with David and Jim. We had this historian come in and talk to us about her experience with homelessness, Catherine. So all that's fun and interesting, and it makes you think. And I also wondered, what all the other things that could kind of give us. So one of our goals was to think through, how we might mitigate. So the resilience, how we might mitigate the consequences of disaster. And there we got, as we should have, a whole lot from people. So from Maria, we got prepare, Boy Scout, prepare. Michael, we got infrastructure. You got to get the infrastructure. Here's what it's like, and here's what we're trying to do. And then Debra engaged with the whole community. And we have to think about that, about how to get everybody involved and how faith-based can be our partners in all this. So there was all that, and then there's the way I think, and I think maybe the way David thinks, with a little bit of epidemiology background and public health background, so that you try to think, well, we want to be able to mitigate the consequences, so we have A to B to C to D, a causal chain, a causal mechanism. And, so what we do is we figure out what those are, and then we come in and we say, well, can we do anything about A? Well, no. B? Well, yeah, maybe. So we try to intervene on B to mitigate the consequences. So we have that way of thinking. But then other ways came up that really startled me. So there's Brian's two communities. Now, that wasn't A to B to C. They declared a war room. So they creatively responded to this thing. Some creative spark occurred. And new stuff happened. And that I wouldn't have discovered that. So where did they get that from? And how can we engender that more fully? And then Catherine's idea. Now, so you're thinking like an epidemiologist, social science, A to B to C. What did Catherine show? She showed us people in parades. Parades, that's not A to B to C. But if you think about what it did for us, what it did for those people, that parade, the remembering, a declaration of personhood. They were out there on the streets saying, don't ignore me, I'm a person. And that's a really powerful intervention for those people. So, and it wouldn't have been thought of from the way I usually think of things. So I thought that was really terrific as well. And then fourth and finally, and then we'll let everybody else talk, the fourth thing was when disasters strike, it reveals things about us that were always there, but maybe we took for granted. That these are like, they're almost like humanizing things. We see ourselves when these things happen. There was a lot about the poverty being expressed after the disaster in the equations and in what people are talking about. There was things about how some people are generally excluded by language and by discrimination, but then when the disaster hits, it's even more obvious and more harmful. And then Jim's natural hazards, and his lines where, if you have lower education, they spread out more when there's more disaster. That his studying of that reveals that vulnerability and that human aspect to it. And then I was really struck by Faith's idea that as a physical scientist, she came to the idea that we needed to have healing. And there was trauma and healing. And I really thought that was something that we learned about ourselves from studying these things. I guess that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I'm sure you've all learned a lot more. I could start with questions. I don't know what your plans are. Or I don't know what you want to do now. I'm sort of done.
Well, I don't know if there's anyone who wants to ask a question that's still pending or whatever, but I at least want to, on behalf of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, thank my colleague Anil Delikar, Dean of School of Public Policy, for brainstorming with me on this, idea that we started talking about last year. And then we pulled in our colleagues and started to really talk about it. But you never really know what something's going to look like until it actually happens. And I was sharing with Maria that, you probably all think we carefully planned how we were going to weave the various different presentations together, and including Bruce's, final observations. I'm really pulling a lot together here. But in fact, what we had was the idea, and we brought in people who we knew had something really great to share with us that we could think about coming from the various different fields that we come from, as well as not only being part of the sort of university community, but being part of, the community of people who, we look to engage and also call us to be engaged with how can we be better at working at some of these important issues that confront us as overall just people who live in the community, whether we're at a university or we're out there, day to day responding to the needs in our communities. So it's been really humbling and a privilege for me to have shared this day with all of you. I'm going to invite Anil to come up and share a few words from his perspective. But I can't say enough. I mean, I keep telling people, why it's important to really highlight the word that I love about our college, which is, we're an interdisciplinary college. And today, I really experience why that's so critical. There is something about those of us who do work in that interdisciplinary space and how we really shine when we actually see our conversations really produce such a phenomenal day for us to think about a lot of the questions that are important to us with regard to not only trauma and disasters, but really the other word, which I think lots of us look to, which is, that part of our human nature to want to survive and be resilient and appeal to our sense of humanity and community in a positive way. So I can't say enough to say thank you for all of you who supported us today, for those of you who came all the way from the other coast, from Florida and from middle parts of the country, and as well as, locally, several counties over. So on behalf of the college and I think the university, thank you so much. So Anil?
Thanks. I should also say this has been a remarkably resilient audience. Okay. Normally in conferences like this, as the hour progresses, the audience sort of tapers off, and towards the end there are like 6 people. But it's amazing. All of you have stayed on, and it just points to the great panelists that we have had, the great discussions we have had. I think everybody has seen the benefit in sticking around and participating in the discussion. Millie is absolutely right. When we didn't start with some preconceived grand framework for this conference, we sort of asked the conference organizers, who are the best people you would like to bring here? And they came up with some names, and then of course, the problem in organizing a conference is always that you have to work around people's availability. And so finally, at the end of the day, people who were available to come came, and it's only after we found out who was coming and what topics they would like to present on that we sat down and said, okay, now how do we put this in a conference setting? And it was amazing. Everything fell in place so beautifully. I mean, thematically, everything fell in place. I thought the day's discussion, the starting with the keynote speech and then the 2 sessions, just sort of dovetailed very nicely with successive presentations. And so thank you so much for making this happen. I hope that we can think about more of these. We'll sort of try to see how we can take some of these ideas and go further with these. For now, I don't think Mark is there. Catherine, can we sort of make sure that we have everyone's PowerPoint so that we'll try to put these up on the website in case people want access to the PowerPoints that were presented today. That's something that we always find helpful. But again, in closing, I would like to thank everyone, all the panelists who came. It's not easy to come all the way from Florida or Texas or New York to Washington to Riverside just for a day-long conference. So really appreciate your taking the time to do this. And thank you to all the audience members for sticking with us and for making this a very interesting conference. Okay.